My name is Drew Waldron, and I am on with award-winning NBC journalist Dan Slepian. Dan, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you, Drew.
Dan, you have such a rich and thorough history as a journalist. What was it that initially pushed you to covering topics like mass incarcerations and wrongful convictions?
What drew me to the issue of wrongful convictions, criminal justice system, mass incarceration was a choice that I did not make. It was something that chose me. And the reason that it chose me was because I witnessed from the front lines what it all means. I did a story about 22, 23 years ago about a police officer and a prosecutor who knew two innocent men were in prison because they knew who did it. And I actually interviewed the real guy who did it. And their convictions were overturned, the innocent guys, but the cop and the prosecutor couldn't get anybody to listen, and they had to fight really hard. And when their convictions were overturned, the DA's office not only didn't let them go, they retried them 2 years later for murder. So my baptism into this world came through the prism of law enforcement, people whose job it is to put people in prison. And they were saying, wait a second, we got this one wrong. And they couldn't get anybody in their chain of command in the police department or in the DA's office to listen to them. In fact, they were both ordered to protect the convictions, basically. Both of them quit their jobs to talk to me on camera about it. I found the real killer. The guys got out, and the DA's office still retried the innocent guys. So when I was doing that story, the innocent guy in that story, his name was David Lemus. I went to visit him on Thanksgiving Day in 2002. I would visit him on Thanksgiving Day because that was the anniversary for the murder for which he was wrongfully convicted. And I went to the prison to interview his mother. And I went into the lobby, and a woman was standing there holding the hands of these two little boys. One was barely up to her waist, one was barely above it. And she stopped me and she said, "Are you Dan?" I said, "Yeah, I'm Dan." She said, "My son, JJ Velazquez, is in here and he's innocent. Can you help us?" Now, I thought this other case that I had just done was a 1 in a million case. I didn't know much about wrongful convictions at the time. And frankly, I didn't really believe her. What are the odds that two innocent people are in the same part of the same prison? I came to find out that David Lemus and JJ Velazquez were in cells next to each other. They shared a cement wall. And so I looked down at those little boys, and I remember JJ's youngest son, Jacob. He was 5. He looked up at me with these huge, beautiful saucer eyes. And I was about to be a father myself. And I left the prison that day thinking, obviously, I have no idea if this guy's guilty or innocent. But it didn't matter to me because I thought that little boy should not be in a prison on Thanksgiving morning. And I made it my own pledge to myself that I would look into it for that little boy. What that turned into was a 23-year journey that changed my life.
I am on with activist for criminal legal reform, JJ Velazquez. JJ, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Drew.
JJ, your personal story is so deeply moving and emotional. I feel like I cannot properly do it justice. So I feel like the best way to start this interview is asking you, how do you share your story with people learning about you for the first time?
Well, my story comes straight from my heart. Like it's not something that you have to make up. It's something that actually occurred. And so it's not something you can forget, particularly because of how traumatic it was, right? And so my reality is I spent 23 years, 7 months, and 8 days incarcerated for a crime I didn't commit. What I've learned on that journey, though, is what I like to share when I speak, because I found a way to turn trauma into triumph and turn pain into purpose. And that purpose has become destiny, right? And so thriving through adversity is something that everyone can relate to. Unfortunately, because of, my incarceration, my adversity was a lot thicker than the other people usually would face in their normal lifetimes. But still, the tools and the perception and how we look at situations, right, will always be useful. And in less threatening situations, it probably will be even more useful. And so I think that there's a lot that people can learn and extrapolate from my experiences that can help them overcome whatever it is that they're going through in their lives. A lot of people think that, well, JJ just talks about justice reform, what should be right, policies. It's not true. We have to talk about life, right? And we have to find ways to get people that may not necessarily be interested in policy reform or justice to see how these policies and how these systems play a role in their lives. And so some of my talks delve into, how the system plays roles in ordinary daily life and things that we take for granted and things that we think are in place for purpose. We dismantle how these systems are actually hurting people and harming people more than they're healing people, right? Recidivism rates in this country indicate that the system has been failing for decades. There has to be a change, and that change is important to everyone because we all want to be safer. And so coming out here, I'm not just an activist for, what's right. I'm not just an activist for people that I may feel like I may have left behind while I was wrongfully convicted. I'm an activist for the quality of our lives because I have children, I have granddaughters, and they're going to have children. And so when I leave this world, it's about leaving behind a legacy that everybody can enjoy, leaving behind an idea and a concept that people can grasp to make this world a better place and so that we can all become better versions of ourselves. Because I spent a lot of time just analyzing other people's lives. And, fortunately for me, I was fortunate enough to earn 2 degrees while I was in prison in behavioral science, which helped me actually understand the complexities of the behavioral tendencies that take place in a small microcosm of what's happening in the world, right? Because prison is like really small, the tension is really thick. And so you see things that you wouldn't see in ordinary life. Maybe for 10 or 15 years, you would see it in your first year in prison. You would see almost everything that you can think of. And it's because you spend all of your time thinking. You're in a cage constantly and you're learning through reading. You're learning through all these different mediums, but it's not actual living. And so the best way to overcome that is to study how other people live. And that's what's helped me thrive. And so I've only been home a little over 3 years. And in 3 years, I went from the cage to the stage, right? I went from being incarcerated and being berated to being in the White House in front of former President Joe Biden and receiving an apology on behalf of the country. I was sitting with him and discussing legal reform and explaining how my experience is important for the world, right? And so, from there, the trajectory started to grow and I started to do more speaking engagements and started having conversations with people from all walks of life and have found that the message is relevant despite where you come from, how you grew up, what environment you live in, what state you live in. It's all applicable because it's about life. It's not necessarily about what happens to us in life. It's much more about how we respond to what happens. And that's what my messaging is about.
Before we started recording, you told me that you thought that mass incarcerations and wrongful convictions, that battling them would be the civil rights movement of our lifetime. What do you mean by that?
The idea of the purpose of incarceration and punishment. Is it just punishment, or are we trying to make people better? I'll give you, and the reason I say I think it's the next incarnation of the civil rights movement is because if you objectively look at the facts, by nearly every metric, what we're doing is not only cruel, but deleterious and harmful to public safety for the rest of us. In other words, We know that water puts out fire. Everybody knows that. It's science. The recidivism rate in the United States, the Bureau of Justice Statistics did a study of more than 430,000 people who left prison and found that an astonishing more than 70%, 70, within 5 years had some sort of interaction with law enforcement or were rearrested and sent back. More than 70%. If you give someone an associate's degree in prison, it drops to like 16%. If you give someone a bachelor's degree and they earn a bachelor's degree, it drops to like 7%. And for the handful of prisons that offer master's degrees, the recidivism rate is 0%. So we know how to keep society safe by doing what we think is uncomfortable to do for people who we perceive as bad people that don't deserve anything. But guess what? Most of the people in prison are not bad people. They're actually really good people who made really bad choices at some point. And so, when we look at the landscape of what we're doing, we always have to remember that the United States represents about 5% of the entire world's population. Yet the United States incarcerates more than 20% of the world's prisoners. So what we're doing here isn't working. And we know it's not working because of the high recidivism rates and the fear that people have of crime. Why do we think people are committing crimes? Whether you're innocent or guilty, a guilty person gets out of prison. They can't get a job. They can't get a loan. They can't get housing. They have to check in for parole in the town next door. They have a big scarlet letter on their forehead. What do we think is going to happen? So that's why I say I think it's both pathological, irrational, and the next incarnation of the civil rights movement, meaning that 200 years from now, not hopefully in my lifetime, I doubt it, 200 years from now, future generations are going to look back at this time where you and I are talking right now today, the way we look at slavery. That's where we are, in my view, when it comes to the issue of mass incarceration.
JJ, you used a phrase earlier that I really liked. You said that you went from the cage to the stage. Now that you've been speaking to all these audiences over the last couple of years and you've been sharing your story, what is the number one takeaway you want your audiences to have after hearing you speak?
Wow, that's an amazing question, Drew. I can tell you this, when I talk about going from the cage to the stage, it was from going from prison to acting, right? And realizing the power that entertainment has to educate and raise awareness, right? To whereas I went around the country with this film, Sing Sing, for 18 months, speaking to the world about the film. And the main message of that film, of Sing Sing Files, the book written by Dan Slepian, of Sing Sing Chronicles, or Letters from Sing Sing, it all comes down to human dignity, right? And it all comes down to me realizing that while I was incarcerated for 23 years, 7 months, and 8 days, I was incarcerated around good people who made bad choices. And if the world could see that and realize that for themselves, they would stop living in fear. Because I realized that the real problems with crime are not only poverty and the lack of opportunity, but it's really promoted by a fear. And we don't realize that the people inside, the people that are incarcerated, the people that we label as domestic terrorists in our world, are actually afraid of the world. They're actually afraid of the people who continue to turn them down and tell them that they were less than. And so they didn't know how to respond to that. And so if we can make this system better, where we can teach these individuals the answers to the problems that they have in their lives at earlier stages, we can prevent these crimes from occurring. And that ultimately will make us all safer. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations.
I think one of the last questions I want to ask you is this topic can be deeply depressing. People like JJ. JJ himself lost 23 years of his life, almost 24 years. I think the last question I want to ask you is on this subject, what are you optimistic about for the future? What progress is being made, and what optimism do you see for the future?
I'm optimistic that I'm talking to you. I'm optimistic that you care. I'm optimistic that you're listening. I'm optimistic that I wrote a book, that I was allowed to write a book about this. Finally, after more than 20 years, people seem to care a little bit more. I'm optimistic that with more pushing, with more education, we can make change. It's funny. I spoke yesterday I'm speaking to 3 high schools this week. I love speaking to students. I'm of a certain age. I think you know what that means now. My daughter is graduating college, and it's not about me. It's about what I've now learned and how that's going to help my kids and grandkids and great the future when I'm long gone. And so the way that I start, and this has just started the past couple of weeks, and I like it, so I'm going to keep doing it, which is with the students. I get up there, and the first thing I say, they just watched the show. First thing I say to them is pause, look around, and I say, put your phones down right now. Turn them over, look up, pay attention. We have a crisis on our hands, and there's only one way to fix it. And you know what that is? You. You are the answer. You are going to need to fix this. You and everybody your age. So if anything that we're saying today may surprise you, and if it clicks and you're interested, don't stop. If you're going to cure cancer, do it with all your heart. If you're going to be a ditch digger, dig the best ditches you can, because we are at a time right now in America, we're in crisis. Doesn't matter what political affiliation you have, everyone will universally agree that personal responsibility is more important than ever. And looking out for each other as humans is really the only reason we're here on earth, to serve each other. This is my form of serving. How are you going to serve? What are you going to do? If you're interested in this, you're going to become a lawyer. If you're kind of interested in it, just be a better juror, right? So I'm optimistic that the same way slavery ended, we can make changes to mass incarceration over time. I'm optimistic that justice, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of justice bends, right? Um, I'm concerned about the pendulum swinging backwards now, which makes this work more important than ever. I'm optimistic that I think that some people seem to care. And I think that, by the way, that's like really kind of a low bar to be optimistic about, but it's something, because we need drastic, drastic change.